All right. Hello, everyone. Another lecture, Systems Development and Frameworks. I'm glad that you're all here. Today's topic is going to be CSS or advanced CSS as promised. And lightning, I will just start right away. And I guess you have some experiences with CSS already. Nevertheless, I'm going to start with something very, very basic when it comes to CSS, and that's the CSS box model. And for that, I'm going to screen share. We will screen share a lot today because my slides aren't that good. And the websites are so much better when they explain. So this is the link that I have on the slides. So if you go to the slides, and you check out those links, they are quite important because we will check them out today. And this one is the Mozilla docs about the CSS box model. And one thing to understand is, the entire article is a really good read and very comprehensive. A couple of things that are important to know is that every element on a web page has a box, and there are two types of boxes, blocks and inline boxes. And then there's also an inner and outer display type. This is also interesting to know. So what about those block and inline boxes? There are a couple of rules that apply by default for block boxes and inline boxes. And inline boxes are usually those elements that appear in the text of a document, for example, anchors, spans, emphasizes, and strong emphasizes, or I don't know, bold. This is usually which is an inline box, and then there are like block boxes, for example, a paragraph, and you have like those rules applied, right? So width and height applied, not applied to an inline, but do apply, for example, to a block box. So that's one thing. Nothing more to say about that. And there we have inner and outer display types, which probably are more interesting to us because we have inner display types, for example, flex or grid. And we'll come to that at the end of the lecture, I hope. So that refers to how elements should be aligned inside the box. And you can control that. So you just assign a display rule, flex or grid, and then this controls then the flow of elements within a box. Otherwise, the default is the normal flow. What's that? Yeah, another article, you can check that out. And we want to talk about the box model. The parts of the box, which is important. So by default, every box has a number of boxes actually. So this is the visible part of the box. How do they call it? The border box, but I think it's like what we usually refer to as a box, which contains the content of the element, a padding, and the border. And outside you have margin. And you can distinguish between the standard CSS box model in which the width and the height applies to the content box. So you have width and height, and that would increase the content box, and then the padding and the border comes on top. There's an alternative box model in which the width and height also includes the padding as well as the border. And why I'm telling you this, I just want to tell you this because I want to show you how you can see these like sizes in your developer tools. So if you just right-click on any element and you say inspect, and you can see what margin is applied, what's the border, what's the padding, and what's the actual content in there, and what is, for example, nice, and what might be a super cool exam question is something like this. So you have two boxes. One is using the standard box model. So this one here has width and height. both of them are boxes. So these CSS rules applies to this and this, but this one is using the border box. So width and height include padding and border radius. And the exercise here, for example, is how can you change width and height in for the alternative box to basically match the same dimensions of the first box. And this is fairly easy. So as I said, alternative box mode, this one here, which you can set by setting box sizing to border box, means both padding and border is included. So, and without the standard box model, the height and width only refers to the content within this box. So if we check it out, you can also see, what you can also see is additionally to this view, come on, what's going on? I want to like jump right into the DOM, right? So if you look closely, I have to leave my mouse here, but if you look on the left side, you see there's div box 390 pixels and 240 pixels. That's the width and height of the border box. And if I go here, you can see that width and height is smaller because the padding and the padding and the border is removed, subtracted from it. So what we have to do here is we just add the remaining padding and border. So we have here a padding of 40 pixels. 40 pixel means you have a padding on all 4 x-axis in this case. So you have a padding here, you have a padding there, you have a padding here, and you have a padding on this side, which means if we have to add this to our height, we have to add it twice because we have padding on the top and on the bottom. And then we have border, same thing. So this one means 5 pixel solid border, and it's also going around this. This is the color that you can see here, right? So in order to make this box the same size as this one, for example, we just have to add twice the border and the padding. We do not have to add margin. All right, so 2 times 40 is, for example, 80 plus 2 times 5, that's 90, right? So 90 pixel, we have to add on both width and height. So this one has width of 390 pixel, and this means we just say 90. And here we have height of 150 pixel, and then we say plus 90, which is 240. And there we go. Now we have resized both of them. So this is just like a nice exercise to understand the CSS box model. To understand what is this about, maybe to play around with your developer tools a little bit. You have to go to in Chromium on Computed. There's a equivalent tab on Firefox. So you don't have to really remember the border box sizing or the normal box sizing, but more like how can you play around with my developer tools? How can I check? How can I see the dimensions of the border box in the Chromium developer tool? So if I hover on a box, you can see the tooltip. Can you see the tooltip? Yuri, can you see the tooltip?
You are now
Yuri?
unmuted.
Yes, that's the tooltip I'm talking about. I was just,
You are now
sometimes for some reason on Linux, tooltips are not displayed on, I don't know, screen sharing or whatever. Yeah, this is what I'm talking about. This is like the border box. So here you can also double check that both boxes are now have the same width and height, right? So that's like a nice exercise. Have a look into this article of Mozilla Docs. It's quite interesting, and that's one of those CSS basics, I would say. Also to understand that you have like the inner and outer type, and when we, for example, add flexbox or grid, then this refers to the inner display type. Cool. That's already it regarding the CSS box model. Any questions so far? And for this one, plus, okay. Any questions so far? Does that make sense? Do you understand the 4 types of the box model? Okay, so far so good. Maybe I forgot one thing to say, and that is that in contrast to padding, margin would collapse. This is something we can see here too. So if you inspect this, if you have margin on the bottom and margin on the top, the 2 margins will collapse. So the orange part is I think it's the margin. It should be. And you can see that the margins overlap. So if you have 2 boxes next to each other, margin will overlap. And so the margin between 2 boxes is then the maximum margin of one of them, right? Does that make sense? You can see that the margin is collapsing and padding is always applied to every box. So the blue part is the content box, the green one is the padding box, the red is the boarding box, and the orange one is the margin box. I don't know why it's so large on the right side, because my developer tools tells me it's 40 pixels margin on both sides. Maybe that's just an issue with how the browser shows it. But yeah, that's important to know, like what's the difference between padding and margin, or when to use what. Margin, for example, you can use that if you want to collapse elements, which is probably what you want. Whereas padding means, yeah, you always want to have this padding around your content. And this brings me to one do, which is, if we think of components, I mean, we were talking about Vue.js components. There's one recommendation that a fellow front-end developer gave to me is, if you don't know where your component is being rendered, prefer padding over margin, because margin has a side effect that it has a side effect on elements outside, whereas padding only has an effect within the component. So if you have a component and you want to increase reusability, then try to fix your problem with padding first, maybe, because you don't know where this component is being rendered, and if you can get your style or the visual appearance as you want it with padding, it's better, because you have less issues if you, for example, use the component in an unknown environment with other components, and then maybe you break the layout or whatever. There's no problem, however, if you apply margin to the nested components, right, or the child components within your component, because if you apply margin only inside, then you have everything under control, right? So that's why I put this on this slide here, which is like a nice rule of thumb. If you don't know where your component is being rendered, think twice before you use margin around your parent component, because you have the side effect. So there's one question in the chat. Make the div inline element in the margin could be shown correctly. Yeah, maybe. Thank you. All right. Another very basic topic regarding CSS is the CSS cascade. So CSS is short for cascading style sheets. And in preparation for this lecture, it was the first time for me to really understand the reasons why some rules are chosen over other rules. I'm going to screen share again to show you this a little bit better. So you can apply CSS rules. And your CSS rules will apply here. And here is a list of CSS rules, which like could be longer, maybe like this. And they are ordered by specificity. So some CSS rules might override another one. For example, this line height is overriding this CSS rule here. And we as web developers have to struggle a lot with specificity of CSS rules. And the reason how the browser decides which CSS rules applies is the CSS cascade. And I'll link to you this nice website which explains it. There's also the standard MDM docs cascade, which is also linked in the slides. Okay, there's CSS cascading style sheets in general. Introduce CSS cascade. This is the thing. I'm going to introduce you to this website, which is like super nicely looking. And there are 4 ways how a browser decides, or 4 basic rules, or tiers, how a browser applies a CSS rule. One is importance, that applies to the CSS rule itself. So we have different flavors of CSS rules, and depending on the CSS rule itself, there might be a distinction. There is the question, where does the CSS rule come from? Was it applied by the user, or does it come from the website, or is it a browser browser style? Then we have specificity. That's what we are interested in the most. Depends on the kind of selector and where the CSS, if it's an inline style. We come to that later. And there is the position. So also the position in the style sheet when a rule is being applied has an effect. So in this case, CSS rules that are at the end of the style sheet win over the CSS rule which come first. So last one wins. So we as web developers are probably not so much interested into this one because we cannot control it. The only thing we are interested in is the website. So we have no control about the browser styles or the styles that are coming from the user. So that's rarely our interest. This one might be interesting, especially this one here. So we have CSS rules, different types of CSS rules. Most of them fall in this level. But there's also animations and transitions, which are more important, which will win. And we can apply bang important to a CSS rule. So we have a CSS rule color, but if we have color and then bang important, then this wins over this CSS rule. All right, so we can increase specificity of the CSS rule by adding important, and then this rule will win over this one. You would likely use this only as a last resort because you want to override third-party styles. You should never need to use this for your own styles. Okay, yeah, so if you have conflicting CSS rules, which, and this one, for example, comes from a third party, you can write your own and override it like this. All right, so the specificity is the kind of selector is also very, very interesting. And it's what we as web developers are the most interested in. So, for example, there's inline styles, and inline styles have the highest specificity of all. I can add inline styles directly. So inline styles are styles that are applied as an attribute within the HTML. So, for example, I want to change the inline style of this div. I can do so, and I'll just say style, color, yellow. And then I have yellow font color. So it's like a CSS rule, which is inside the HTML template, has the highest specificity of all. However, For the rest, we use selectors that will match some sort of like CSS selector, which will match a particular part of the HTML. And there are different ways how to like address elements. You can assign IDs, and an ID would be an attribute ID and then some ID, and then you can later on address this with a CSS selector ID. Yeah, can I write a CSS selectors like here, just like that? Probably not. I can add CSS rules here, but yeah, but you see a CSS selector, for example, here. So this is a class which has a dot, which
You are now unmuted.
Hallo? Ja. Einfach in the chat.
You are now muted.
Hallo? Kannst du mich hören, Juri?
You are now unmuted. You are now
Okay.
muted.
So, sind denn noch meine Folien da? Ja. All right. So what I was talking about, CSS cascade, right? Share my screen. And open another window, CSS cascade, CSS cascade. So four different kinds, like groups of rules. Can you see my screen?
You
No,
are now
screen sharing has
unmuted.
stopped.
You are now
Why?
muted.
I didn't do anything. Can you see my screen?
You are now unmuted.
Good.
You are
So
now muted.
remember, four different groups or tiers of rules, and each tier has a different levels of importance. The CSS rule itself, where does the CSS rule come from? From the browser, from the website, from the user? What kind of selector is being used? And where does the CSS rule is written in the style sheet? So, and we are most interested into the specificity of the selector. Inline styles are the most important. And then we have three other levels. IDs are most specific. Then we have classes. And then there's the type. So the type refers to HTML type. So this, for example, is a type selector, which is on level 4. And this here is an inline style, which you can see here. So obviously inline will win. All right. This is a CSS class. You can see this with a dot. This is an ID, which you can see with a hashtag symbol. So IDs are more important. So this is going to win. Then we have CSS class and what is it? A pseudo element, a pseudo class? Not quite sure. Anyways, it's a CSS class, and here we have level 4 and CSS class again. Yeah, so this is also important. The number of hits highest reached. I'm not 100% sure, actually. I would say it's probably this one. And I'm always sometimes struggling with when we have a tie, which one's going to win. So both of them have a CSS class, but yeah, so pseudo class and class wins over CSS class and type, right? So we have 2 times 3 on the left side and 3 and 4 on the right side. So both of them, the highest level which we reach is a class, but because the left side has 2 hits on this level, this will win. There is another there's another way how to play around with specificity. I have this on my slides, so 1 second. CSS. To make this even more clear, I have the specificity calculator. So this helps a lot. Here you can add your selector of choice. You can, for example, make a selector a class, and then it will show you which level it will reach. And there's, for example, another class, and you have this like 1 hit on this level again, right? So these two are have the same specificity, but if I add another class or yet another class, then I have 2 hits on this level, and this one will win. So if I sort by specificity, then this one is more specific. However, if I add something that's like an ID, some ID, then I have 1 hit on this level, and this will win, right? Because this one has like 0 hits on the ID level. Then this is also a really nice way of like playing around with specificity. I hate this word, by the way. Yeah, this helped me a lot in order to understand how the rules apply. What does it mean for us? For us, this means that you want, yeah, so check out these 4 things, and especially this one, because this is what we web developers have to struggle the most with. And for us, this means that we quickly, if we develop a large code base, we quickly have the problem that we have like a CSS global, and we have CSS rules coming from somewhere in the code base which apply to my element that I'm currently working on, and I don't want this for some reason. But the problem is I have like lower specificity than the other one, and so I have to do something like assign an ID or add the important CSS rule in order to get more specificity. And that's what is called a specificity war. And we want to avoid this. And there are common best practices and rule sets how you should use selectors. And one of them, one very famous one, is called BEM, block element modifier. And the idea here is that you always use one unique class for your selector, right? If you have a piece of template, then the most general part of the CSS class is the block. So you could apply this to main components. And then you have elements within this template, and then you would address them as block elements. This, you divide or you separate the names with a double underscore, because this double underscore is not considered a separator in CSS. This is still one CSS class. And if you want to have additional states, for example, you want to have like a dark button or a light button or a large button or a small one, then you can add modifiers to it. And those modifiers will have additional CSS rules, maybe overriding the other CSS rules. And the contract is, or the promise is, that you always use only one CSS class and you enumerate the CSS classes in your template. And you write the most specific CSS classes. So let's say the longest CSS classes, those with modifiers and so on, at the end of the CSS style sheet. So the most specific one have precedence over the one which are coming first, or the more general ones. So that's how you can override the more general CSS rules. And the guarantee here is that if you follow this rule strictly, will not run into specificity wars, because you always use a single class, no combination of selectors, and it's always on the same level. That's the whole idea here. We can also check out the documentation a little bit. So BEM, I think I have also added this on the slides. So this is like the whole idea in general. You can check out the they have the entire rule set somewhere here. I always struggle a little bit to find all the whole rules, the whole like the API specification, so to speak. So I'm going to check out the things that I've added. Yeah, this one is a particularly good explanation why you want to use BEM. So also it was apparently invented by Yandex a couple of years ago. And it also, another side, or like a positive side effect of this, is that you can reason about your CSS classes. So yeah, you know, if you have, for example, an element like this, you know, this button is always, this appears in a component or a block called site search, right? So you encode this kind of information into this one. I prefer, because you have really long CSS classes, I prefer another flavor of BAM, which is called RSCSS. So RSCSS was invented with components in mind, and it has a slightly different rule set, which has smaller CSS classes, but they use a fixed set of combinations. So if you follow their rules, it's the same guarantee. You will not run into specificity wars. And you have smaller CSS classes, but they have they restrict how you can name your components, for example, or how you can name modifiers. So, for example, components must have 2 words, and they must be separated with a dash. So you can always see if it has a dash, it must be a component. And modifiers are always without any dashes. So if you have multiple like words, first name, they must be written together. And they're using this operator here. This means only direct child. So if we have like an element which has class profile box, this selector means only the direct child of profile box, right? And this avoids that your CSS rules for profile box leak into nested components. Like if you have a component and you have a couple of subcomponents which you want to render, you usually don't want to apply your CSS rules to those subcomponents because they have their own styles. In order to avoid this leakage, you limit the number of child selectors or the child elements. Just to explain this a little bit, if you, for example, write, okay, you have friendly body page elements and header nav. So I think I can, for example, select class body and then this div inside with body, what was it? Header nav. Actually, I think I can also do the same thing in this elements tab, right? I can just say Control F, find by string selector. Oh yes, nice. So body, header, nav, and then I select only this one. Here I'm lucky because there's no other element which has this, so this class. But for example, if I say div, this white space means any div which is inside a body, and this also applies to any sub elements. I don't know why it's not. Yeah, okay, you can see it 1 of 6, so it is the yellow part is being marked, but I have a number of hits. However, if I say only the direct child, then I have 3. Is that right? Yes. Okay, I have 3 diffs which are direct childs of this element here. I hope you can see that. And this is what RCSS is using. It's just, let's say, a flavor of BAM. Instead of using a single unique class, they are using smaller class names, and they sometimes use a combination of it. And I think it's a little bit nicer to read. But the same idea applies to both, like, class name conventions. Yeah. Let's maybe make a pause. Are you still with me? Are there any questions? Does it make sense what's the idea of the two rule sets, BAM and RCSS, that you want to have, you keep your specificity low in order not to run into the specificity wars? Not too many people are answering the poll. Maybe I should also have a look into the public chat. Yeah, the last homework will be about styling. Okay, I'm going to just publish this result. Not too many people have answered the poll. Are there any questions regarding BEM, or regarding why you don't want to, or maybe why you want to keep your selector specificity low? Like, why do you want to do that? Maybe I should explain this a little bit more in detail. It's actually quite simple. If you have a high specificity because you use IDs, for example, or because you use bang important, there's not much space to override these rules then anymore, because they are so high in specificity already that you have no way of applying your own rules. So if you have, I don't know, yeah, I don't think I can explain it any better, to be honest. I hope that makes sense. Okay, I will go to the next slide. I hope, yeah, it's certainly a good read to look into BEM. It's quite important in order to maintain a larger code base. I already explained this one, why you should avoid bang important. It's like a last resort to override third-party styles. If you work with your own styles, you should never need to use bang important. If you use bang, or you happen to use a bang important in order to override your own styles, then you have a problem, and you should fix the styles which you want to override, right? So they must be somewhere in your code base, and you must go there and reduce the specificity of those rules instead of using bang important. Because if you do that, then good luck overriding this one. Okay. Then another thing, which is very, very interesting. There's a new standard in CSS called custom properties. Maybe some of you have heard about less or ZAS, which introduce variables. So those are preprocessors. They are tools which get an input in a specific language which is being transpiled into CSS later on. And you can at build time declare variables, for example. And these variables are then later on compiled into all those CSS rules where you use the variable. And in the last years, custom properties have been introduced into the CSS language itself. So you actually don't need to use SCSS anymore. And I also linked more. Yeah, I linked a lot of examples here. So this is more or less how it looks like. You have -- first color, and you can then use this var syntax in order to reference the value that you added here. So paragraph, for example, has a color 16F something. I think it's red. And you can override this color then in any other like element. So your custom properties are scoped to the element, which means if this paragraph happens to be inside a container, then it gets this color. But if this paragraph happens to be inside this, just somewhere, then it will get this color. And those custom properties are more powerful than the equivalent in SCSS. So I told you about ZAS and SCSS, and this is how you would write a variable there. And the variable is then transpiled into CSS at build time. However, with CSS, you can, those custom properties are much more flexible, because they can, for example, also changed at runtime. And and you can, the same CSS cascade applies to those variables, which opens up nice features. For example, you can define something like color themes, and you just specify an attribute. So the square brackets here is the syntax for addressing CSS attributes. So if you have an element in your HTML which has the attribute data theme, then it should have a background color of this custom property and a text color of this custom property. And then you can change elements and switch them to another. Like you have this selected here, which means it must have an attribute data theme, which with a particular value, which is default or dark. And here you have the actual definitions of those custom properties, which leads to super nice and easy ways how, for example, to switch the theme, the color theme of the entire website to, well, to another color theme. And not only that, you can also add anywhere you want inside your HTML. You can add the attribute data theme and set it to a different value in order to give like certain parts of your website a different color theme. And this wasn't so easy with SCSS. Yeah, this is what I'm talking about. For example, you have one button, and the only thing that you would change is you change this particular attribute somewhere on a global level, and then all the colors change. And yeah, that's super awesome and handy. If you would have to do the same thing with SCSS, you probably have to change all the classes in your entire HTML, in your entire DOM. And here you just have to switch just one particular attribute, which is like super nice.
You are now unmuted.
Yeah, so see custom properties. Yes. So
You are now muted.
at least since 2018, because this one is a blog post from 2018, and it's like, is this one? Maybe the other one. And in this blog post, they're still, yeah, 2018. And in here, they say, what's the catch? Browser support. But this one also is, I think, from 2019. So back in those days, the browser support for custom properties haven't been yet. So 2019 haven't been so great. But let's check out custom properties, or let's check out can I use first. So can I use is another really good recommendation of mine. If you ever want to know what's like supported by a browser, you can go to caniuse.com and just enter custom property. Actually, it's one of those, I couldn't see that. But it's, I think, one of the most recent, no. People are more interested in the Flexbook and CSS grid. But anyways, custom properties, I thought I saw it there. So it's well supported. Yeah, you can use it nowadays, unless you want to support Internet Explorer. But I mean, is Internet Explorer actually being used nowadays on modern Windows systems? Is it still there? I don't know.
You are now
Maybe
unmuted.
you know. I'm not a Windows user anymore. Yeah. All right. Yeah, good to know.
You are now muted.
So that's about custom properties. I heard from my front-end developers that you are, yeah, my friends who are front-end developers told me that you don't actually need to use SCSS anymore because of that. But sometimes they still do, because those CSS preprocessors also offer like shorthand syntaxes for your CSS rules, but you don't actually need them anymore now because this problem with those variables have been fixed and custom properties are even better. Or you can combine both. Like there are folks out there who use SCSS plus custom properties. Maybe I should make a break here. Are you still with me? Oh, 12 new messages. I'm going to have a look. Sometimes when visiting a website, they automatically switch to dark if your desktop theme is dark. How do they know that? I don't know. Yeah, SCSS is easier to use for shorthands, exactly. Yeah, good. So what does my poll say? Most of you are happy with that. So I think I can continue on to the next slide. Yeah, I mean, CSS is really a broad topic, much more than I can fit into one lecture. There are some best practices I found on the internet. For example, when you think of units, this could also be confusing for beginners like me, for example. And there's this units best practice, which basically says use, has a set of recommended and occasional units used for screen. That's what we are interested in the most. And from what I get from this best practice is if you should use EM, which is a relative size based on the font size. This one, the EM size is based on the elements font size. The REM size is based on the root elements font size. You can use both and use these if you want to have use units which should grow with your font size, for example. That's, for example, being used for margins. And you can use pixels for anything that should be an absolute unit. For example, border width. That's usually something you want to be that doesn't need to grow, and therefore you can use pixels. Sometimes you also can use viewport width or viewport height, but this link here says that there are some problems with browser support and implementation. So use them with caution. That's also something interesting. That was another recommendation by a fellow front developer. I didn't know that, for example, if you do this, then you have a lot of unintended side effects. And so you should not use shorthand syntax for some CSS rules because, yeah, you're unsetting things. And one of the most important statements in this blog is that you should always try to do as little as possible. Because it's really hard to undo your CSS changes, or it's really hard to debug those when you don't know why does an element look like that right now. And so you try to stick as much as possible to the defaults and don't unset or set things if not really needed. And now we come to CSS Flexbox and CSS Grid. I don't have a battery. Sorry, my battery's at 10%. Now it's being charged. Okay, CSS Flexbox and CSS Grid. Those are two technologies how you can create a layout. CSS Flexbox is used if you want to align items along one axis, and CSS Grid is a more modern standard which is used to align items along two axes, that is on the X and on the Y axis. And CSS Flexbox is basically just aligning them in one direction, so either vertical or horizontal. And I mean, there are so many resources out there how you can learn CSS Flexbox. I personally learned Flexbox with Flexbox Defense, which is like a nice game, an interactive game, how you can learn Flexbox. So let's check that out. So this is like a browser game where you do tower defense, and then you have to like align your towers along an axis. For example, you have your tower group, and you want to use I don't know, for example, justify content. What was it? Where's the reminder? For example, center. And why not? And then you can start the wave and there are enemies, and then your towers are going to shoot them. Right? Okay, you get the point. And this is like 12 lectures, and then you know Flexbox. And this is like aligning items along one axis. Oh no, one survived. Okay. And you get some points, and then you can go to the next lesson. This is like really nice. And there's apparently something similar for CSS Grid. CSS Grid Garden, not as aggressive or warlike, but apparently you can place items in your garden then, which is super nice. Someone recommended to me Flexbox Froggy, also a nice game. But yeah, if you don't like to play games, there are still those Mozilla docs, which explain Flexbox and Grid very well. And what we are going to do now is we focus a little bit on Grid in the live demo. I have 30 minutes left, which is nice. So we'll come to CSS Flexbox and CSS Grid at the end of the lecture. I just basically put a lot of links on this slide because there are so many ways how to learn Flexbox. I have 2 remaining slides, which is another set of recommendations. You should always check if you use certain CSS features the browser support. So you already saw Can I Use? There's another one from Mozilla, Platform Status, which you can also check out for browser support. And another recommendation, this was suggested to me by a front developer. I should introduce you to that. Post CSS, which is applying some, which is post-processing your CSS and applying browser or vendor-specific vendor-specific prefixes. So that's probably 99% of all cases, this is what you want, right? And I was just asking, can you, my friends, can you recommend post CSS without any condition or drawbacks? And they said yes. Just you can use it and it makes your CSS better, more or less. All right. I think it's time for a live demo for CSS Grid and CSS Flexbox. Are there any questions regarding the theory part of this lecture? There's one more question or one more message. Flexbox zombies. Can you put this maybe in the shared notes? Someone is writing. No, I think that's, so someone's asking if post CSS makes sure your style looks the same in every browser. I think it's trying to fix some problems which can be automatically fixed. So they use, what do they say? They use knowledge from Can I Use and apply that automatically for you. So over time, post CSS will do different things. Add vendor prefixes using values from Can I Use. I think not all problems will be solved, but I mean, some can be solved, and why not, right? So it doesn't hurt, apparently. And I must admit, I don't know post CSS yet, but I haven't used it, but it was recommended to me, and it can help you to avoid some errors, like, I don't know, incompatible ways of defining colors. Apparently, some browsers have problems with full screen. Good. Any more questions? I guess you must have different browsers. So the question is, how can you test how your website looks in different browsers? You can either install them on your machine. So if I'm on Linux, for example, I can at least install Mozilla, Firefox, and Chrome or Chromium. I cannot install Internet Explorer, but you can, for example, try, I think there is a Windows Docker version, which also opens a visible screen something, and then you can start a browser and see how your website looks. That's one way. And there's also remote services for that, which do cross-browser testing. So there's a website which I forgot the name of, but you can give it a URL, and it will make screenshots for you how your website looks in different browsers. And that's also a way of testing how your website looks in different browsers. Has the drawback, of course, that you must deploy your website, or you must tunnel your local computer to the internet with ngrok or local tunnel. Yeah, browser stack. Thank you very much. Can also be used for local testing. How? Paula, can you just unmute yourself and tell us how you can test a browser, or how you can use browser stack for local testing? Does it open a tunnel? Or do you install something? Okay. Paula doesn't write anything, and she doesn't unmute herself. So I know browser stack can help you with cross-browser testing.
You are now muted.
And someone put something into the shared notes. That's probably Flexbox Zombies. Thank you very much. All right, now to the live demo. There will be one more homework, a last homework, which is like smaller. It only goes for 1 week. Our exam will be on February the 10th. So if the current homework has a deadline until January 27th, then there's 1 week until we have Wednesday, the 3rd of February. And I want you to have the last week for preparation for the exam, right? So maybe we have one last homework, which is smaller than the other ones, where you can try out a little bit to use like CSS. And my idea was that you get some style specifications, which is just a PDF, which looks like this. So you have a website which should look on desktops like this, and on mobiles it should look like this. And then you have, for example, a sidebar, which is if you click on this button, should move from one side, from the left or from the right side maybe. And then it's your job to implement that website or this layout. And you can do this with any technology you want. So you can do this with CSS plain, so not using any framework. But on next week, my dear friend Greg is introducing us to Tailwind. So you can also use Tailwind in order to accomplish that. Or you can use Vuetify, which is like a massive component library. And I think using Vuetify will probably be the least effort to do this. So depending on how much you want to learn, you can choose either the easy path or the more difficult one, but this will be more educational. I wanted to give you a live demo about CSS Grid and Flexbox. So I'm going to start what I have right now in order to implement this website or this layout with CSS only, so not using any framework. So I have a Nuxt application, and right now the website looks like this. So you have a header, like a hero image, then a couple of items. Maybe this could be your news posts for your Hacker News website, and then some footer. And it's like a little bit responsive. So when you go on a smaller device, then the items collapse, and they also change their appearance. So the image placeholder here is on the top. When you're on a desktop, when you're on a mobile, image placeholder collapses to the left, and the items themselves will collapse in one column. And yeah, so you have a header component which has some menu items, and when you make this a little bit smaller, those menu items will vanish, and instead you have one button which you can click in order to open the sidebar. And this is how you can, for example, test out view transitions if you want to implement everything from scratch. Or if you use a component library like Vuetify, Vuetify has a sidebar component which you can use in order to get the same behavior, more or less. What I would like to introduce you is CSS Grid in the remaining 20 minutes. So CSS Grid is one of those inner display types, and I used CSS Grid in order to style how the elements should behave of those items. So I have a component called portfolio item. I hope you can see enough. I have a component called portfolio item, and oh no, portfolio item. Oh yeah, so, and this one is using a grid. You can see this one here. So display grid turns every portfolio item into, and we give every portfolio item a inner type of grid. Just to show you how this looks. So we have our header, and we have our index page, and the index page has the hero image and the portfolio list, and the portfolio item is, this component, and has some text and a title. And so each of those here are view components. This is like the component I showed you. You can rename this. This wouldn't be a portfolio item for you, probably something like a news item or hacker news item or hacker news post. Doesn't matter. You can name it as you want. And if you would, for example, use plain CSS, you can just use display grid. There are other ways how to accomplish the same thing. I'm pretty sure that you can do this with Flexbox too. But I used grid. And if you use grid, what's nice in Chrome or Chromium and Firefox is that you can debug your grid components. So as a sad grid aligns items along two axes, both in the X and the Y axis. And if you have a display type grid on one of your HTML nodes, then your browser will show you this button grid. And you can then turn on this button, and it will show you how many columns and how many rows you have. So right here, this is just a number of rows. That we have 4 rows, and they have indices. So there's the first row, which starts here. There's the second row, which starts here, the third row, and the fourth row. And I have this piece of HTML. I have an image. I have a header. Then I have a paragraph, and then I have this button where you can click on more, and then something is supposed to happen. Right now, there's nothing happening. And they are aligned in 4 rows. And in order to accomplish that, you can say display grid. And then they say grid template rows, which tells the browser that you have inside this element, you have 4 rows. And if you want, you can assign every item, for example, the image. So this one here has a class image. And I'm using RCSS here. So I'm using this selector which says inside a portfolio item, I want to have the first child which has the class image. So this these CSS rules don't apply to whatever other components I'm rendering here, for example, custom button. This is how I can like avoid the leakage of my CSS rules. And here I say nothing, because by default, the order of those elements is the same order as the rows on the grid. So the image will go into the first row, the next item in the HTML node, that is the header, will go into the second row, and so on. So for desktop devices, it's like very, very basic. The remaining CSS rules don't have a big meaning here. It just means I want to have the header aligned in the center, but I don't want text aligned for the paragraph, for example. And this justify self makes sure that the image will be centered as well. I can remove that if you want, and you can see how it changes. Now we'll have all those images on the left. Boom. So this CSS rule, for example, is responsible for aligning the image in the center of the row. Then I can add media queries. Media queries helps you to override your CSS rules depending on the browser width. So in order to debug this, you can click on this item here in Chrome. Firefox has a similar button, and you can play with different devices, or how your website would look like on different devices. And you can, based on the width of your browser viewport, you can change your CSS rules, and then your website, for example, is being styled in a different way. This means if your screen is less than 960 pixels, then those CSS rules should apply. And these CSS rules they have selectors, portfolio item, for example, and they override what's already there. So these are the defaults. I'm not doing mobile first here, because my default is the desktop environment. And I have the special case, which is like the mobile view. You can do it other way. You can make the mobile view the default. If you would, for example, develop mobile first, and then your desktop is the special case, so to speak. It's also possible. But if I'm on mobile, I want the image, for example, to be on the left side. And it should be on the same height like the paragraph. And I can do that by changing the grid from 4 rows to 3 rows and 2 columns. Here I'm saying 3 rows. This means take as much space as you want. And this means 1 fraction. So this applies to the second row. So that's the paragraph and the image. And somewhere I should have my columns. I think there is a problem, because I haven't specified how many columns I have. I'm just specifying which element should go into which column. Okay, sorry for that, but I'm a little bit confused why I don't have this anymore. Nevertheless, there is this CSS rule specifies if I have my portfolio item, which has the display type grid, I can assign to each element, if I want to, where on the grid it should appear. I can, for example, tell the image, you should appear on the second row and the first column. And I can do this by specifying grid row, that is like the second row. You can see this 2 here, so it will appear on the second row. And the first column. The first column is also here, so it will appear in this cell.
You are now unmuted.
And The default is again the default how the HTML is laid out.
You are now muted.
So if I'm not specifying it, it will be the first row, the second row, the third row. And so that's fine. All I have to say then for the remaining items is which column should they belong to. So in order to avoid that my header is appearing on the first column, I have to tell it to go to the second column, and then it's appearing in this cell. Likewise with the paragraph and the button. I mean, I can remove that, and my guess is that the header will show up here. There we go. Interesting, and I have a nice side effect. Okay, fair enough, but you get the point. So I'm myself still a little bit struggling with CSS grid, and you can see, yeah. 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 So 959 pixels. I'm still new to CSS styling websites with CSS only. So in the past, I was using component libraries, for example, Vuetify. I decided not to introduce you to Vuetify first. However, Vuetify has predefined breakpoints for mobile, for tablet, for desktop, and large screens. And one of those breakpoints is 960 pixels. I think that's the tablet. I'm not 100% sure. And anything below that is considered mobile for me now, because this is like how I defined it. It's hard coded. You can define it with a variable too, and then you could change your breakpoints at a central location. But you get the point, right? So the number is coming from Vuetify. And it's I'm told it's medium, large tablet to laptop. So that's like the breakpoint. Let's check it out. Vuetify breakpoints. Display breakpoints. There we go. So that's where this number is coming from. But Vuetify will be a topic of next week. So I don't want to introduce you to the component library, which is so powerful that you don't have to write any CSS anymore, because first we should learn how to use CSS without any frameworks. Yeah, but that's the reason for the number. And of course, you can question if that's maybe not so great to have this number hard-coded here, because you shouldn't use magic numbers. Does it answer the question? Oh, yes, of course. So I think when you use yarn create next app, then if you have to answer some interactive questions, and one of them is, hey, do you want to use a component library or a CSS library? And then you have like, I think 9 or 10 choices already. And one of them is Vuetify, which is, in my opinion, the biggest one and the most convenient one, but also the most inflexible one. And there's also Tailwind, which is interesting. And there are a number of other component libraries. Vue.js component library. I mean, you can basically use any component library you want. Yeah, Bootstrap is one of them. Try it out. There we go, Bootstrap Vue. So there's a component library for Twitter Bootstrap if you want to use that one. Yeah, Twitter Bootstrap is originally a CSS framework only, and was invented a long time ago before there was something like components. Yeah, but yeah, a lot of people are still using it. And yeah, for educational purposes, I decided against introducing you to a component library already. Hope that answers the question. And if you well, just say yarn run create or yarn create next app. I mean, you can do that right now. Oh no, it's installing a lot of packages. Okay, I'm not going to do this. You can try this out on your own computer, but it will ask you for like a number of front-end libraries, component libraries as well. Does it answer the question? All right. Okay. Maybe since I have a couple of more minutes left, I'm going to introduce you to view transitions. So we want to have this mobile menu visible on smaller devices. And there is a nice feature of Vue.js called Vue.js transitions, which is helping you if you want to do things like that. Vue.js transitions. That's like a default feature of Vue.js. Yes, this one here. So you have a component transition which comes with Vue.js included, and it helps you to create those transitions. It's only adding classes or attributes. So let's have a look. Inspect. Maybe you should have a look into the page header. So I have transitions here. So this is like the visible part of the top menu. I declared a class desktop only and mobile only. So these links are visible only on desktop and this one only on mobile. Where does that come from? I just created it myself. So here I have mobile only, which is display none, and I override it on smaller devices with display block. And instead, desktop only will be hidden. So the effect of that is that you don't see on larger devices, you don't see this menu button, but you see those links instead. And on smaller devices, you see this button. And then I can click on this component. I created like a custom button component, which you can then style. And I'm changing the like some state show. Well, I'm toggling show from true to false. And in the sidebar, there's the equivalent, which is also toggling the same state. So this is how I can open and close the sidebar. And this transition here is not doing anything for me except adding classes. So if you look really closely, then you should see that there are some CSS classes being added at runtime. I hope you can see that, like the screen sharing is quick enough that you can see there are some CSS classes being added to the component. Something like slide in, enter, active, slide in, leave, right? So that's the only thing that the transition component is doing for you. But then you can write your own CSS animations based on those classes. So these classes here, fade interactive, fade leave active, and so on, they are coming from Vue.js, and you can write your CSS rules then and write transitions. How does it look like? So we basically just manipulate a CSS rule called margin right. And we wanted this to be to take like this the whole transition to be 1 second. This is like the duration of it. And this all refers to all CSS rules declared in this block. So margin right should be overwritten within the duration of 1 second. So if I have another margin right, which is -80 viewpoint width, then yeah, so going from here to there is closing the sidebar. Going from there to there is opening the sidebar because I have a negative viewport width. So viewport is the width of the entire screen. And the margin is now, where can I see the margin top? It is on the, can I see the margin top somewhere? Didn't really debug this properly, but yeah, I override this with the respective CSS class. Yeah. So this refers to the this refers to all CSS rules here. Hopefully I can debug this when I click on this button. There you can see it. So it still has it, sidebar, slide, enter, and there we have AT viewport width, which makes it to be outside of the screen. Why 80? Because I have also a width of AT viewport width. So that's the trick here. So it's AT viewport width wide. And if I add a margin of -8 point, okay, I have to think about it again. I'm a little bit confused, but it's like moving it from left to right, and then behind the visible part of the screen. Yeah. Oh yeah, now this is the confusion. It's margin right. So negative margin means it's moving from left to right. Right? So margin right would otherwise move it from right to left if it would be positive. How does that look like? Yeah. Goodbye. And that's why we have negative margins, a little bit confusing. And it's moving it from left to right. And margin right 0 would mean open it. So open it and move it from right to left. So if these numbers here have to match, that's the whole idea. Does it make sense now? This is how you can do it. I think there are more elegant ways of doing this. And you are free to check them out. All right. Yeah.
You are now unmuted.
15:29. It's the end of the lecture. Time for questions. Yes. So the trigger of the animation is plain Vue.js. I have a button with a click event, and it's just changing some state from show to not show. And it's like toggling a particular property show. And the show is being used here in the VIF. Right? So the entire HTML tree here is not being is not in the HTML DOM node when show is false. So when show is false, it's not there. When show is true, it's in the DOM, and you can see that. So if I click on the menu, the sidebar is there, and it will vanish completely when I click on the X, and it's on, like, the transition has stopped. So now it's gone, right? It's not even inside the DOM anymore. It's not being hidden or something. It's actually removed. But yeah, this is Vue.js behavior of transitions. Yes? What my plan is to have preliminary exam prepared by the February the 3rd and not have a lecture, and instead make a test run of the lecture. So that's my goal. I haven't prepared a Moodle test, so I'm leaning towards using Moodle for the exam. And I hope I can create a catalog of questions until February the 3rd. And on February the 3rd, that's my plan, we make an exam like for practicing, because I want you to, for example, paint diagrams of a Git graph. If you check out the exam in the homework repository, there you can see that some of those exercises you have to write code like this, and you are supposed to paint a Git graph. Or, well, this is not a Git graph, but this is like a state of a database. Where's the Git graph? There we go. So this is like a scenario, and your job is to paint this graph. And in order to practice this a little bit, because you must need an external tool and then create an image and then upload it for the exam, I want to use February the 3rd to make sure that everyone here is able to, to have everything set up in order to create those diagrams and upload them later on, as well as write code in your editor of choice, and then use this piece of code and then upload it as a file, for example. Does it make sense? And in order to practice that, I would say let's make like a test run. Does that answer the question? All right, I'm going to have a look into the public chat myself. Trigger for the animation. Bootstrap the breakpoints is a bit different. You specify 3 values and those are the rows. Yeah, those are like implicit. I don't really have to specify them. I only have to specify them if I want to have a part of the HTML DOM node and place them on the grid somewhere. And there's a natural way how the elements are placed on the grid if you don't specify it, like a default behavior. Yeah, I answered the question with 995 pixels. Yeah, cool. No questions anymore? I mean, now's the time. No one is writing. No one is unmuting. I would say let's call it a day and we see each other in the seminar. I'm going to stop the recording now. Bye.